Lieutenant Amelia Hayes stepped off the military transport at Camp Ironridge with nothing but a worn medical bag and a reputation that preceded her like a whispered warning. The Montana wind cut through the high desert compound as she surveyed the sprawling military base carved into the red rock canyons. What none of the 50 battle-hardened soldiers watching her arrival could have imagined was that within 3 weeks, this soft-spoken Army nurse would grab a rifle and demonstrate a level of precision that would leave grown men trembling with fear and respect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust hadn't even settled from the transport truck when the whispers began. Amelia could hear fragments of conversation drifting across the motor pool as soldiers sized up the newcomer. At 28, she looked younger than her years. Her auburn hair pulled back in regulation style, wire-rimmed glasses perched on a face that belonged more in a library than a combat zone. Her uniform was crisp but clearly new, without the sun-bleached wear that marked the veterans of Camp Ironridge. "Great, another desk jockey playing soldier," muttered Sergeant Jake Morrison, his voice carrying across the formation loud enough for Amelia to hear. Morrison was everything the Army recruitment posters advertised: 6 feet of muscle, crew cut, and a swagger that spoke of countless hours on the firing range. His followers, a tight-knit group of infantry specialists, nodded in agreement. "Look at those hands," added Corporal Danny Reeves, pointing at Amelia's pale, unmarked palms as she adjusted her glasses. "Bet she's never held anything heavier than a stethoscope. What's she gonna do when the real shooting starts? Take our pulse while we're getting shot at?" The laughter that followed was harsh and immediate. Amelia pretended not to hear, focusing instead on the folder in her hands containing her assignment orders. She'd been transferred from the 47th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital to Camp Ironridge's Forward Medical Unit, a posting that should have been routine. What the orders didn't mention was that Camp Ironridge was primarily a training facility for elite combat units, where medical personnel were expected to keep pace with soldiers who lived and breathed warfare. As she walked toward the medical facility, her soft-soled shoes silent against the gravel, Amelia became aware of the eyes following her every move. The base operated on a simple hierarchy: combat soldiers at the top, support staff somewhere below, and medical personnel who couldn't handle a rifle ranked barely above civilians. It was a culture that valued aggression over gentleness, speed over precision, and volume over quiet competence. Colonel Harris, the base medical officer, greeted her with professional courtesy tinged with skepticism. He was a career military doctor who'd earned his stripes in 3 different conflicts, and his weathered face showed every year of service. "Hayes," he said, reviewing her file with a slight frown. "Impressive medical credentials. Johns Hopkins, top of your nursing program, exemplary performance at 3 different assignments. But Camp Ironridge isn't like other postings." He gestured toward the window where they could see soldiers conducting live-fire exercises, the crack of rifles echoing across the canyon walls. These men train for combat deployment in hostile environments. They don't have patience for medical personnel who can't keep up or who slow them down with unnecessary caution. Speed and efficiency are everything here. Can you handle that? Amelia nodded, her voice steady despite the obvious warning. "Yes, sir. I understand the requirements." What Colonel Harris didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Amelia Hayes carried secrets that would have shocked every person on the base. Her personnel file listed her previous assignments as routine medical postings, but buried deep in classified records was a different story. Before nursing school, before the gentle bedside manner and wire-rimmed glasses, Amelia had been someone else entirely. Her real education had begun at age 12 on her grandfather's ranch in rural Wyoming, where old Daniel Hayes, a Korean war sniper, had taught his granddaughter skills that had nothing to do with medicine. Every summer for 6 years, while other girls her age attended camps and sleepovers, Amelia had learned to read wind patterns, calculate bullet drop, and place shots with surgical precision at distances that would challenge professional marksmen. Nursing is a fine calling, Amelia, her grandfather had told her during their last summer together. But never forget, sometimes the gentlest hands hide the strongest skills. The world will try to put you in a box based on what it sees. Don't let it. Those lessons had been locked away for over a decade, buried beneath medical school, nursing training, and years of saving lives in sterile hospital environments. She'd never mentioned her marksmanship background during military processing, seeing no reason to complicate her medical career with irrelevant skills from her youth. Now, as she unpacked her modest belongings in the cramped quarters assigned to medical staff, Amelia could hear the sounds of the base settling into its evening routine. Through her thin walls came the constant chatter of soldiers discussing weapons, tactics, and training exercises. She pulled out a small leather journal, not medical notes, but something far more personal. Inside were hand-drawn diagrams and calculations that would have looked familiar to any sniper. Wind charts, ballistic coefficients, range cards for different terrains. She'd kept the journal as a memento of her summers with her grandfather, never imagining it might someday prove relevant to her military service. A sharp knock interrupted her unpacking. "Nurse Hayes?" called a gruff voice. "Colonel wants all medical personnel at the evening briefing." The briefing room was packed with combat soldiers, their conversation dying to a murmur as Amelia entered. She found a seat in the back, noting how the room seemed to divide naturally, infantry and special operations personnel in front, support staff relegated to the rear, medical personnel scattered along the sides like afterthoughts. Colonel James Wellington, the base commander, stood at attention behind the podium. He was a man who'd earned respect through 30 years of military service, his chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of a soldier's soldier. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wellington began, his eyes sweeping the room, "Camp Ironridge exists for one purpose: to prepare the finest soldiers in the United States Army for combat deployment in hostile environments. Every person on this base, regardless of their specialty, must be capable of contributing to that mission." His gaze lingered momentarily on the medical section. "In combat, there are no safe positions, no non-combatants, no one who gets to sit on the sidelines. Medical personnel who can't keep up with combat operations are a liability that gets people killed." The message was clear. "Adapt or ship out." As the briefing concluded and soldiers filed out discussing weekend training exercises and marksmanship competitions, Amelia remained seated, lost in thought. Around her, she could hear fragments of conversation that painted a picture of the challenge ahead. $20, says the nurse, requests a transfer within a month, someone whispered. Give her 2 weeks, came the reply. First time she has to patch up someone under fire. She fold like a house of cards. Hope she's better at taking blood pressure than she'd be at taking fire. Amelia closed her leather journal and tucked it into her pocket. These soldiers saw gentleness and assumed weakness, saw medical training and presumed incompetence with anything beyond bandages and bedside manner. They had no way of knowing that the woman they'd already dismissed had spent her formative years learning skills that would make their marksmanship instructors weep with envy. But she wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. She was here to do her job, save lives, and serve with the quiet dignity that had always defined her approach to military service. If they wanted to underestimate her, that was their choice. What none of them could foresee was that Camp Ironridge was about to face a crisis that would test every assumption they'd made about courage, competence, and what it truly meant to be a soldier. And when that moment came, the gentle nurse they'd written off would grab a rifle and remind 50 hardened warriors that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody sees, coming, preparing, and narrating This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Camp Ironridge operated on a philosophy as rigid as the red rock formations surrounding it. Warriors first, everything else second. The base's culture had been forged over decades of combat deployments, where hesitation meant death and gentleness was a luxury no soldier could afford. Every morning at 05:00 hours, that philosophy was reinforced through a ritual that left no doubt about what the base valued most. Amelia discovered this firsthand during her second day when the entire base assembled for the weekly combat readiness demonstration. The main parade ground buzzed with anticipation as soldiers gathered around a series of shooting stations, each designed to showcase different aspects of military prowess. Digital scoreboards displayed real-time rankings, turning lethal skills into competitive entertainment. "Listen up, people," boomed Sergeant Major Thompson, a mountain of a man whose voice could carry across 3 counties. His chest was a museum of military decorations, each ribbon telling the story of conflicts where his leadership had proven decisive. Camp Ironridge doesn't produce clerks, cooks, or clipboard warriors. We forge weapons. Human weapons capable of bringing hell to America's enemies. The assembled soldiers stood straighter, feeding off the energy of a man who embodied everything they aspired to become. Thompson's eyes swept across the formation, lingering disapprovingly on the small cluster of medical personnel standing awkwardly to one side. "Every person on this base will be evaluated on 3 criteria," Thompson continued, his voice cutting through the morning air like a drill instructor's whistle. "Speed, accuracy, and lethality. How fast can you identify a threat? How accurately can you neutralize it? And how effectively can you eliminate the enemy before they eliminate you?" At the first shooting station, Sergeant Morrison was already demonstrating those principles. His rifle moved with practiced precision as he engaged pop-up targets at varying distances. Each shot was followed by an immediate transition to the next target, his movements fluid and economical. The digital timer displayed his completion time, 47 seconds for a 12-target course that challenged even experienced shooters. "Outstanding time," Morrison called out Lieutenant Colonel Bradley, the base training officer. "That's the kind of performance that keeps Marines alive in Kandahar." The praise carried across the range, reinforcing the message that speed and aggression were the ultimate virtues. Behind Morrison, a line of soldiers waited their turn, each eager to prove their worth on the scoreboard that ranked every participant. The competition was fierce in public, with daily updates posted in the mess hall showing who had earned the right to call themselves Camp Ironridge's finest marksman. Corporal Reeves stepped up to the line, his confidence evident in every movement. He'd been Morrison's closest rival for months, consistently placing in the top 5 rankings. His approach was different, less methodical than Morrison's, more instinctive but equally effective. His rifle barked rapidly as he engaged targets with the kind of aggressive tempo that combat instructors praised. 51 seconds, Reeves," announced the scorekeeper. "Good shooting, but Morrison still holds the lead." The competitive atmosphere was infectious. Soldiers cheered for exceptional performances, groaned at missed shots, and constantly compared scores with the intensity of athletes pursuing Olympic gold. Every successful run was analyzed for technique that could be copied, every failure dissected for weaknesses that could be avoided. From her position near the medical station, Amelia watched the proceedings with growing understanding. This wasn't just training, it was cultural indoctrination. The message was clear: your worth as a soldier was measured by your ability to kill efficiently and without hesitation. Everything else, including the medical skills she'd spent years perfecting, was secondary to the primary mission of delivering violence on behalf of the nation. "Hayes," Colonel Harris appeared at her elbow, his voice low enough to avoid attracting attention. "See what you're dealing with here? These men live and breathe combat effectiveness. They respect one thing: demonstrated competence with weapons under pressure. Everything else is just noise. Amelia nodded, but her attention was focused on details the others seemed to miss. She noticed that Morrison's rapid shooting style, while impressively fast, occasionally produced shots that were marginally outside the high-scoring zones. Reeves had a slight tremor in his non-shooting hand that suggested caffeine dependence or stress-related tension. Several other shooters showed signs of rushing their breathing patterns, sacrificing potential accuracy for speed. These observations went against everything the base valued. In the world of Camp Ironridge, pointing out such details would be seen as nitpicking from someone who couldn't match their performance. The culture demanded that you earn the right to criticize by first proving your own superior ability. The morning's demonstration concluded with a special exhibition by Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the base's senior marksmanship instructor. Rodriguez was a legend among the soldiers, a career marksman who'd served as a designated marksman in 3 combat deployments. His shooting was poetry in motion, smooth, controlled, devastatingly effective. "Watch and learn, people," Rodriguez called out as he approached the firing line. This is what 20 years of dedicated marksmanship training looks like. His rifle seemed to become an extension of his body as he engaged targets at distances that challenged even advanced shooters. Each shot was deliberate, each movement economical, each result precisely where he'd intended. The final scoreboards told the story of Camp Ironridge's hierarchy. Rodriguez dominated the instructor category, Morrison led the enlisted rankings, and a handful of other soldiers filled out the top positions. Medical personnel weren't even included in the competitive rankings, their scores relegated to a separate category labeled non-combat support. As the crowd dispersed, conversations naturally turned to the upcoming base-wide marksmanship competition, an annual event that determined bragging rights for the entire year. Winners received additional leave time, preferred duty assignments, and the kind of respect that opened doors throughout their military careers. $10 says, "Morrison takes the overall title this year." Amelia heard one soldier betting. "I'll take that action," replied another. Rodriguez has been coaching him, but Reeves has been putting in extra range time. Could be anyone's game. The betting continued as soldiers headed to their various duty assignments, but the underlying message remained constant. Marksmanship excellence was the currency of respect at Camp Ironridge. Everything else, medical training, administrative skills, technical expertise, was valued only insofar as it supported the primary mission of creating superior shooters. Back in the medical facility, Amelia found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time since arriving. The morning's demonstration had crystallized something she'd sensed from the moment she'd stepped off the transport truck. Camp Ironridge wasn't just a military base. It was a temple dedicated to the worship of controlled violence, and she was an outsider in a world that had no place for her. Gentleness. Colonel Harris found her reviewing medical supply inventories, her wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Sobering morning, wasn't it?" he asked, settling into a chair across from her desk. "It was educational," Amelia replied carefully. "Let me give you some advice. Hayes, these soldiers don't respect medical personnel who can't keep up with their world. You want to earn their trust? You need to prove you understand what they do and why it matters. Otherwise, you'll always be just another support staffer who doesn't belong." Harris's words carried the weight of experience, but Amelia detected something else in his tone, resignation that suggested he'd long ago accepted his secondary status in the base's hierarchy. He'd found his place by acknowledging the superiority of the warriors and focusing on supporting their mission rather than challenging their assumptions. That evening, as Amelia walked past the enlisted barracks, she could hear fragments of conversation drifting through open windows. The soldiers were analyzing the morning's shooting demonstration with the intensity of coaches reviewing game footage, discussing technique modifications and training adjustments that might shave precious seconds off their times. "Morrison's reload sequence is costing him time," she heard one voice analyzing. If he could cut 2 seconds off his magazine changes, he'd be unbeatable. Reeves has the speed, but his groups are opening up under pressure, came another assessment. Speed means nothing if you're missing the vital zones. The conversations continued late into the evening, a constant reminder that marksmanship wasn't just a skill at Camp Ironridge, it was an obsession that defined personal worth and social status. Soldiers who couldn't shoot with exceptional skill were assigned to support roles, their careers effectively capped by their inability to excel in the base's primary measure of competence. As Amelia prepared for sleep in her Spartan quarters, she reflected on the day's lessons. Camp Ironridge had created a perfect ecosystem where aggressive competence was rewarded and gentleness was systematically discouraged. The soldiers weren't wrong about the importance of marksmanship in combat. Their lives would depend on exactly the skills they spent their days perfecting, but she also recognized something the culture seemed to miss. The same obsession with speed that made them formidable in training scenarios might blind them to subtleties that could matter in real combat situations. The base had created warriors who excelled at known distance shooting under controlled conditions, but war rarely provided such predictable circumstances. From her window, she could see the shooting range where tomorrow would bring another day of competitive demonstrations. Soldiers would once again prove their worth through speed and accuracy, reinforcing the cultural values that had made Camp Ironridge legendary throughout the military. What none of them could anticipate was that their perfect system was about to face a test that would reveal the difference between range shooting and combat marksmanship. And when that moment arrived, the gentle nurse they dismissed would demonstrate that sometimes the most important skills are the ones that can't be measured by a stopwatch or displayed on a digital scoreboard. Base had taught her its values. Soon, she would teach them hers. The mockery began in earnest during Amelia's first week when she was assigned to accompany a training patrol as the medical support specialist. The mission was routine, a 12-mile tactical march through the canyon system surrounding Camp Ironridge, designed to simulate combat patrol conditions while providing medical personnel with field experience. Sergeant Morrison had been designated patrol leader, a role that gave him authority over every aspect of the exercise, including the deployment of support personnel. As the squad assembled at 0400 hours, Morrison made his priorities clear with the kind of blunt assessment that had become his trademark. "All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a babysitting assignment today," Morrison announced, his voice carrying across the pre-dawn darkness. "Command has decided we need to drag along some medical support, so everybody say hello to Nurse Nightingale here." He gestured dismissively toward Amelia, who was adjusting the straps on her medical pack with methodical precision. The soldiers chuckled at Morrison's nickname, but the humor carried an edge that Amelia recognized immediately. She'd been reduced to a caricature, the gentle, helpless medical professional who needed protection while the real soldiers did their job. It was a role that would define every interaction for the foreseeable future. "Corporal," Reeves picked up the theme with enthusiasm. "Hope she brought plenty of bandages, because she's gonna need them for her own blisters before we're halfway done." More laughter rippled through the squad as they began their equipment checks, each comment building on the assumption that medical personnel were soft, unprepared for the physical demands of military operations. "Think she's ever carried a full pack more than 50 yards? Added Private Jenkins, a young soldier eager to prove his belonging with the veteran squad members. "Maybe we should assign someone to carry her gear when she starts falling behind." The comments continued as the patrol moved out into the canyon system, each soldier adding their own variation on the theme of Amelia's presumed incompetence. What they didn't notice was that she matched their pace effortlessly, her medical pack properly distributed, her breathing controlled and steady, even as the terrain became increasingly challenging. First real test came at the 4-mile mark when the patrol encountered a steep ravine crossing that required rappelling down a 40-foot cliff face. The soldiers approached the obstacle with casual confidence, their equipment handling skills honed through countless training exercises. Better let the professionals handle this part. "Doc," Morrison called out as he prepared the rappelling equipment. "Don't want you getting hurt before we even reach the objective." He turned to address the squad with exaggerated concern. "Somebody's gonna have to help our medical friend here. Can't have her breaking a nail on the rocks." The laughter was immediate and harsh, but Amelia simply nodded and waited her turn. When Morrison finished his descent and called for the next soldier, she stepped forward without hesitation. Her movements were efficient and controlled as she checked her harness, tested her anchor points, and prepared for the descent with the kind of methodical precision that spoke of extensive training. "You sure you know what you're doing up there, Florence Nightingale?" Morrison called from below, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "It's a long way down if you mess up the technique." Amelia's descent was textbook perfect, smooth, controlled, with none of the jerky movements or hesitations that marked inexperienced rappellers. She touched down at the bottom with the same quiet competence that characterized everything she did. But the squad's reaction was telling. Instead of acknowledging her skill, they treated it as a lucky accident. "Must have had some basic training somewhere," Reeves muttered, as if competence from medical personnel was so unexpected that it required explanation. "Probably practiced on a climbing wall at some fancy college." The patrol continued deeper into the canyon system, and with each mile, the comments became more pointed. Private Martinez, trying to impress the senior soldiers, began a running commentary on Amelia's performance that was designed to highlight every perceived weakness. "Check it out, guys. Doc's actually keeping up. Maybe she's tougher than she looks." The words sounded supportive, but the tone suggested that toughness from a nurse was as surprising as intelligence from a rock. "Course, we're not even at the hard part yet. Wait till we hit the vertical climb at checkpoint 3. Checkpoint 3 presented exactly the challenge Martinez had mentioned. Near vertical rock face that required both technical climbing skills and significant upper body strength. The soldiers attacked it with aggressive confidence, each trying to demonstrate superior technique and physical conditioning. Morrison led the way, his movements economical and sure as he found handholds and established the route for the others to follow. "This is what separates the warriors from the wannabes," he called down to the waiting squad. "Real soldiers don't get stopped by a little rock climbing." One by one, the soldiers completed the climb, each adding their own commentary about the challenge and their superior preparation for such obstacles. When Amelia's turn came, the entire squad had positioned themselves to watch what they assumed would be an entertaining struggle. "Take your time, Doc," Morrison called down with mock encouragement. "Nobody's keeping score, and we've got all day to watch you figure it out." The implication was clear. They expected failure, or at best, a prolonged struggle that would confirm their assumptions about medical personnel. Amelia began her climb with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else. Her movements were deliberate rather than aggressive, efficient rather than showy. She found handholds that others had missed, chose routes that minimized energy expenditure, and climbed with a rhythm that suggested extensive experience with such challenges. "How the hell," Jenkins started to say, then caught himself. The squad watched in growing confusion as Amelia completed the climb not just successfully, but with a technique that was arguably superior to several of their own efforts. "Lucky," Reeves declared, as if that explained everything. "Must have done some rock climbing as a hobby or something. Doesn't mean she could handle it under combat conditions." The rationalization was important to maintain their worldview, acknowledging that medical personnel might possess superior skills in areas related to combat operations would undermine the entire hierarchy that defined their identity. Better to dismiss competence as luck or irrelevant civilian training than to consider that their assumptions might be flawed. The patrol's midpoint objective was a simulated casualty evacuation scenario, designed to test both combat skills and medical response under field conditions. Morrison briefed the exercise with the kind of detailed tactical analysis that demonstrated his expertise in such operations. "We've got a man down in a hot zone," he explained, pointing to a marked position on his tactical map. "Enemy contact probable. Extraction complicated by terrain and time constraints. Medical personnel will provide trauma care while combat elements establish security and prepare for evacuation." The scenario unfolded exactly as designed, with blank ammunition creating the chaos and noise of combat, while Amelia worked on the simulated casualty Private Rodriguez, who was playing the role of a soldier with multiple trauma wounds. The squad's performance was professional and efficient, each soldier executing their assigned role with practiced precision. What they didn't notice was that Amelia's medical response was faster and more comprehensive than anything they'd seen from previous medical personnel. Her trauma assessment was complete within seconds, her treatment priorities flawlessly established, her communication with the evacuation team precise and informative, patient stable for transport. She reported to Morrison, her voice calm despite the simulated gunfire erupting around their position. "Primary concern is potential internal bleeding, secondary injuries to left extremities. Recommend immediate helicopter evacuation to Level 1 trauma facility." Morrison acknowledged the report with professional courtesy, but his post-exercise debrief focused entirely on the squad's tactical performance. Amelia's medical response wasn't even mentioned, as if competent trauma care was simply expected background support that didn't warrant analysis or praise. The return march provided ample opportunity for the squad to dissect every aspect of the exercise, with particular emphasis on their own superior performance under challenging conditions. The conversation naturally turned to comparisons with previous exercises and speculation about upcoming training scenarios. "Remember that last medical support we had?" Jenkins asked, warming to a favorite topic. "Guy practically fainted at the sight of fake blood. At least this one didn't embarrass us completely." "Bar's pretty low for medical personnel," Martinez replied. "As long as they don't get in the way or slow us down, I call it a win. Not like we're expecting them to contribute anything meaningful to the mission." The comments continued as the patrol covered the final miles back to base, each soldier adding their own assessment of medical personnel they'd worked with previously. The theme was consistent medical support was a necessary burden, useful for treating injuries but otherwise irrelevant to real military operations. Back at Camp Ironridge, the patrol's after-action report would focus entirely on tactical performance, physical conditioning, and leadership effectiveness. Amelia's contributions would be noted in a single line: medical support adequate for mission requirements. It was the kind of damning praise that suggested competence so minimal it barely deserved acknowledgement. That evening in the enlisted mess hall, the patrol story became part of the base's informal communication network. Morrison's account emphasized the squad's superior performance while treating Amelia's competence as an amusing footnote. "New medical support isn't completely useless," he reported to an interested audience. "Actually kept up pretty well. Didn't slow us down too much. Course, that was just basic training stuff. Wonder how she'd handle a real deployment where the stakes actually matter." The assessment spread through the base's social networks, establishing Amelia's reputation as competent enough to avoid embarrassment, but unremarkable enough to dismiss. She'd been categorized as adequate medical support, functional but forgettable, useful but uninspiring. Colonel Harris found her completing her patrol report in the medical facility's administrative office, her documentation characteristically thorough and precise. "How did it go out there, Hayes?" he asked, settling into a chair with the satisfied expression of someone whose expectations had been confirmed. "Successful exercise, sir. No injuries, objectives met. Squad performed professionally throughout." Harris nodded approvingly. "Good to hear. Morrison's squad has high standards, so if you kept up with them, you're doing something right. Just remember your job is to provide medical support without getting in their way." Do that consistently, and you'll earn their respect over time. The advice was well-intentioned, but it carried the same underlying assumption that had defined every interaction since her arrival. Amelia's role was to be competent enough to avoid criticism while remaining invisible, enough to avoid challenging the established hierarchy. Success meant being useful without being threatening, skilled without being superior. As she walked back to her quarters that evening, Amelia could hear fragments of conversation from the various barracks buildings. Soldiers were discussing the day's training exercises, analyzing performance, planning improvements for future operations. Their conversations reflected the intense focus on excellence that defined Camp Ironridge's culture. What they couldn't know was that their assessment of the new medical support had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. They'd seen adequate performance and assumed it represented her full capabilities, competent basic skills, and concluded they understood her limitations. In her Spartan quarters, Amelia opened her leather journal to record her observations from the day's patrol. Her notes weren't about medical procedures or trauma protocols, but about wind patterns in the canyon system, sight lines from elevated positions, tactical movement through varied terrain. The kind of observations that would have surprised soldiers who thought they understood exactly what she was capable of achieving. The mockery would continue, she knew. Each day would bring new assumptions about her limitations, fresh evidence of their superior capabilities, additional confirmation that medical personnel existed to support rather than lead military operations. They'd created a comfortable hierarchy that placed her safely below their own position in the base's social structure. But hierarchies built on assumptions rather than demonstrated capability are inherently unstable. And when Camp Ironridge faced its ultimate test, the soldiers who'd spent weeks mocking the gentle nurse would discover that their most dangerous assumptions were about the people they'd never bothered to truly evaluate. The first crack in Camp Ironridge's assumptions about their gentle nurse came during an unscheduled equipment inspection 3 weeks after Amelia's arrival. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had decided to conduct a surprise audit of all personnel weapons maintenance, a routine procedure designed to ensure that every soldier maintained their assigned rifle to military standards. For most soldiers, weapons maintenance was a weekly ritual performed with varying degrees of attention to detail. Some, like Morrison and Reeves, treated their rifles with the reverence of craftsmen, understanding that their lives might depend on mechanical reliability. Others viewed it as tedious busy work, completing the minimum requirements without genuine understanding of the intricate systems they were maintaining. Amelia had been assigned a standard M4 carbine upon her arrival, along with basic weapons training that medical personnel were required to complete. The assumption was that she would learn to clean and maintain the weapon adequately enough to pass inspection, nothing more. Medical staff weren't expected to develop genuine expertise with small arms. They just needed to avoid embarrassing themselves during mandatory training. When Rodriguez reached Amelia's station during the inspection, he approached with the casual expectation that he'd find adequate but unremarkable maintenance work. Medical personnel typically managed to keep their weapons functional without demonstrating any real understanding of the sophisticated engineering involved. "Let's see what we've got here." "Hayes," Rodriguez said, picking up her M4 from its designated position. His hands moved with practiced expertise as he began the standard inspection routine, checking for proper lubrication, component wear, and overall cleanliness. What he found made him pause. The rifle wasn't just clean, it was maintained to a standard that exceeded most of his combat veterans. Every component showed signs of meticulous attention, from the perfectly adjusted gas rings to the precisely calibrated trigger mechanism. The bolt carrier group gleamed with professional-grade care, each surface treated with exactly the right amount of appropriate lubricant. "Hayes," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying a note of surprise that caught the attention of nearby soldiers. "Where did you learn to maintain a rifle like this?" The question hung in the air like an unexpected challenge. Around the inspection area, other soldiers paused their own preparations to listen to an exchange that might reveal something interesting about the base's medical support. Basic weapons training covered maintenance procedures. "Sergeant," Amelia replied with characteristic understatement. "I followed the technical manual specifications." Rodriguez continued his inspection, but his movements had become more deliberate, more focused. He was no longer conducting a routine check. He was examining the work of someone who clearly understood weapon systems at a level that contradicted everything he'd assumed about medical personnel. Technical manual doesn't cover trigger job modifications, Rodriguez observed, testing the rifle's trigger pull with professional interest. "This has been adjusted for precision work. Clean break, minimal overtravel, reset distance optimized for rapid follow-up shots. This is custom gunsmith work." The inspection had attracted a small crowd of soldiers who recognized that something unusual was developing. Morrison and Reeves had stopped their own preparations to watch an exchange that was heading in an unexpected direction. "Is there a problem with the rifle, Sergeant?" Amelia asked, maintaining her professional composure despite the growing attention. Rodriguez looked at her with new interest, his experienced eye taking in details he'd previously overlooked. "No problem with the rifle, Hayes. Question is, where did a nurse learn to do precision trigger work that most of my infantry specialists couldn't accomplish?" The silence that followed carried weight. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that didn't fit their established understanding of personnel capabilities and training backgrounds. "Grandfather taught me basic gunsmithing," Amelia said simply. Seemed like useful knowledge for maintaining military equipment. It was a truthful answer that revealed nothing about the depth of her actual expertise. Daniel Hayes had indeed taught his granddaughter gunsmithing, but his instruction had gone far beyond basic maintenance. He'd trained her to build precision rifles from components, to diagnose mechanical problems that stumped professional armorers, to modify weapon systems for specific applications that most soldiers never encountered. Rodriguez set the rifle down with obvious respect. "Basic gunsmithing," he repeated, his tone suggesting that he wasn't entirely convinced by her modest explanation. "Well, whatever your grandfather taught you, this is some of the finest weapons maintenance I've seen in 20 years of military service." Compliment rippled through the watching soldiers, creating the first moment since Amelia's arrival when medical personnel had been acknowledged for superior performance in an area that mattered to combat operations. It was a small crack in the established hierarchy, but cracks have a tendency to widen under pressure. The conversation continued in that vein, with soldiers trying to reconcile the evidence of Amelia's technical competence with their established beliefs about medical personnel capabilities. Most settled on explanations that preserved their worldview. She'd been lucky, or had received unusual civilian training, or simply had more time to focus on maintenance, because she wasn't engaged in serious military training. Rodriguez's assessment had planted seeds of doubt about their complete understanding of the base's newest medical support specialist. Those seeds began to sprout the following week during a routine equipment familiarization exercise. The training was designed to ensure that all personnel, regardless of specialty, maintained basic proficiency with standard military weapon systems. Medical staff participated, primarily to fulfill regulatory requirements, rather than to develop genuine combat skills. Exercise involved supervised shooting at known distances under controlled conditions, exactly the kind of predictable scenario that allowed soldiers to demonstrate their superior training and experience. Most medical personnel managed to achieve minimal qualifying scores, while reinforcing everyone's assumptions about their limited capabilities. When Amelia's turn came, she approached the firing line with the same methodical precision that characterized everything she did. Her movements were economical and deliberate as she assumed a proper shooting position, adjusted her equipment, and prepared to engage the standard qualification targets. "Take your time," "Doc," Morrison called from the observation area, his voice carrying the patronizing encouragement typically reserved for beginners. "Nobody expects miracles. Just try to hit the target somewhere." The first shot surprised everyone, including Amelia herself. Not because she'd missed, she hadn't, but because the impact point was exactly where she'd aimed, dead center of the target at 100 yards. The precision was noteworthy, but explainable as beginner's luck or careful concentration. The second shot landed in exactly the same location, creating a hole marginally larger than a single bullet diameter. The third shot expanded the hole by an almost imperceptible amount. By the fifth shot, it was clear that something extraordinary was happening. "Jesus Christ," whispered Rodriguez, who was observing the exercise through binoculars. "She's shooting a 1-inch group at 100 yards with iron sights. I've got infantry specialists who can't do that with optics." The firing line had gone completely silent except for the methodical crack of Amelia's rifle as she worked through the qualification course. Each shot was delivered with mechanical precision, her breathing controlled, her position rock steady, her follow-through textbook perfect. When she finished the course and stepped back from the firing line, the target showed a level of precision that exceeded anything the observers had seen from medical personnel and matched or exceeded most of their combat specialists. "Hayes," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying a note of professional respect that hadn't been there before. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" Once again, all attention focused on Amelia as she provided an explanation that revealed nothing while explaining everything. "Grandfather taught me marksmanship fundamentals," she said, removing her safety glasses with characteristic calm. "Seemed like important knowledge for military service." Rodriguez walked to the target and examined the shot groups with growing amazement. "Fundamentals," he muttered, measuring hole spacing that would have impressed competitive shooters. "Your grandfather must have been one hell of a teacher." The impact of Amelia's shooting performance rippled through the base's social networks like a stone thrown into still water. Soldiers who'd spent weeks dismissing her as typical medical support found themselves confronting evidence that their assumptions might have been fundamentally flawed. "Maybe she's got some kind of natural talent," Jenkins suggested during that evening's debriefing session. "Some people are just born shooters, right? Doesn't necessarily mean she could handle combat conditions. Natural talent doesn't explain that kind of precision," Morrison replied, but his usual confidence had been shaken. "That was trained shooting, professional level fundamentals. Question is, where does a nurse get that kind of training?" The speculation continued, but the tone had shifted. For the first time since Amelia's arrival, soldiers were discussing her capabilities with something approaching respect rather than dismissive amusement. The change was subtle but significant. Colonel Harris found Amelia completing her post-exercise equipment cleaning in the medical facility's armory. His expression mixed pride with curiosity as he settled into a chair to discuss the day's unexpected developments. "Impressive shooting today, Hayes," he said, consulting the official qualification scores. "Rodriguez says it was some of the finest marksmanship he's observed from any personnel, medical or combat. Want to explain how a nurse develops that level of precision?" Amelia continued cleaning her rifle with the same meticulous attention to detail that Rodriguez had noticed during the inspection. "Family background included hunting and competitive shooting, sir. Seemed prudent to maintain those skills during military service." It was another truthful but incomplete answer. Her family background had indeed included those activities, but at a level that would have shocked anyone who understood the true scope of her training. Daniel Hayes hadn't just taught hunting and competition, he'd trained a potential sniper to standards that exceeded most military programs. "Well, whatever your background, you've certainly gotten people's attention," Harris observed. "Rodriguez is recommending you for advanced marksmanship training. Says it would be a waste not to develop those skills further." The recommendation represented a significant shift in how Camp Ironridge viewed its medical support specialist. Advanced marksmanship training was reserved for personnel with demonstrated exceptional ability and potential for specialized roles that went far beyond standard medical duties. "I'm honored by the recommendation, sir," Amelia replied, "but my primary responsibility is medical support. I wouldn't want additional training to interfere with those duties." Harris nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of attitude that builds respect around here. Focus on your primary mission while developing secondary capabilities." Just the approach these combat soldiers appreciate. That evening, as Amelia walked past the various barracks buildings, she could hear fragments of conversation that revealed the ongoing impact of her shooting demonstration. Soldiers were analyzing her technique, speculating about her background, reassessing their previous assumptions about medical personnel capabilities. "Maybe we've been too quick to write off the medical staff," she heard one voice suggesting. "If they've got people with that kind of shooting ability, maybe they're more capable than we assumed." "Still doesn't make her infantry material," came a defensive reply. "Shooting targets on a known distance range is different from combat operations under pressure. Let's see how she handles herself when things get real." The comments reflected the base's struggle to reconcile evidence with established beliefs. Amelia's demonstrated capabilities were forcing them to reconsider their assumptions, but institutional biases don't change overnight. They were looking for explanations that would allow them to maintain their worldview while acknowledging her obvious competence. In her quarters, Amelia opened her leather journal to record observations from the day's training exercise. Her notes focused not on her own performance, which had been exactly what she'd expected, but on the tactical implications of the base's shooting standards and the potential applications of precision marksmanship in various combat scenarios. The soldiers of Camp Ironridge had glimpsed her capabilities, but they'd seen only the smallest fraction of what she was actually capable of achieving. Their assumptions about gentle nurses and medical support limitations were beginning to crack under the pressure of demonstrated competence. But the real test was yet to come. Soon, Camp Ironridge would face a crisis that would reveal the difference between range shooting and combat marksmanship, between theoretical knowledge and practical application. And when that moment arrived, the soldiers who were just beginning to question their assumptions about their medical support would discover that everything they thought they knew about Lieutenant Amelia Hayes was merely the tip of a very deep and dangerous iceberg. The discovery that would change everything that Camp Ironridge began with. Something as mundane as missing inventory reports and escalated into a revelation that would shake the base's command structure to its foundations. It started during Amelia's 4th week when she was assigned to conduct a routine audit of medical supplies in the forward aid station, a task that typically involved nothing more challenging than counting bandages and updating inventory spreadsheets. The forward aid station was located in a converted bunker on the base's eastern perimeter, positioned to provide rapid medical response for training exercises in the canyon system. It had been constructed during the base's early years and retrofitted multiple times as medical protocols evolved, resulting in a maze of storage areas, equipment rooms, and administrative spaces that few personnel fully understood. Amelia approached the audit with characteristic thoroughness, cross-referencing physical inventory against digital records with the kind of methodical precision that had become her trademark. What she discovered within the first hour was a pattern of discrepancies that raised immediate concerns about supply chain integrity and potential security violations. "Colonel Harris," she reported after completing her initial assessment, "we have significant inventory irregularities that require immediate attention." Harris looked up from his administrative work with the weary expression of someone accustomed to bureaucratic complications. "What kind of irregularities, Hayes? Missing supplies, damaged equipment, paperwork errors?" "All of the above, sir, but the pattern suggests something more systematic," Amelia consulted her detailed notes, her documentation characteristically comprehensive. Medical supplies are disappearing at rates that exceed normal consumption. Expensive equipment is being requisitioned for exercises that never appear on official training schedules. And there are access logs showing facility entry during off-duty hours by personnel who lack proper authorization. The implications were serious enough to warrant Harris's full attention. Missing medical supplies could indicate anything from administrative incompetence to black market trafficking, while unauthorized access suggested potential security breaches that could compromise base operations. How extensive are we talking? Harris asked, his tone shifting from routine interest to genuine concern. Based on preliminary analysis, approximately $40,000 worth of medical supplies and equipment over the past 6 months. The pattern accelerates significantly in the past 8 weeks, coinciding with increased training activity and the arrival of new personnel. Harris sat back in his chair, processing implications that extended far beyond routine supply management. $40,000 represented a substantial security breach that would trigger investigations from multiple agencies if reported through proper channels. Hayes, I need you to continue this audit discreetly. Don't discuss your findings with anyone else until we understand the full scope of the problem. Can you handle an expanded investigation without attracting attention? The request placed Amelia in a delicate position. Expanded investigation would require access to areas and records that were typically restricted to senior personnel, while discretion meant working without the backup and support that such investigations normally warranted. Yes, sir. I can conduct a comprehensive audit while maintaining normal duty schedules. What level of access authorization should I request? Harris considered the question carefully. Granting broad access to someone with Amelia's relatively junior status would attract attention, but limiting her investigation might compromise the thoroughness needed to understand the full scope of potential security violations. I'll provide you with temporary access to all supply records and facility areas under medical department authority. If you need access to other areas, coordinate with me directly. And Hayes, if this investigation reveals what I think it might, we could be dealing with a situation that goes far beyond missing bandages. Over the next week, Amelia's investigation expanded from routine supply audit to comprehensive security analysis. Working during off-duty hours to avoid attracting attention, she methodically documented access patterns, supply movement, personnel assignments, and training schedules that painted a disturbing picture of systematic resource diversion. The missing medical supplies were being diverted to support training exercises that weren't appearing in official records. Expensive equipment was being requisitioned for operations that seemed to exist in a parallel command structure, separate from the base's normal training programs. Most concerning of all, the personnel involved in these activities included soldiers whose official assignments should have precluded access to medical facilities and supplies. Her breakthrough came when she discovered a series of requisition orders signed by personnel who were supposed to be on leave during the dates in question. Cross-referencing personnel records with supply movement logs revealed a pattern of authorization fraud that suggested coordination at levels that extended into the base's command structure. Colonel, Amelia reported during a private briefing in Harris's office, the supply diversions are supporting a training program that doesn't exist in official records. Personnel are being deployed on exercises that aren't being reported to higher command, using equipment and resources that are being systematically diverted from legitimate operations. Harris reviewed her documentation with growing alarm. The evidence suggested a rogue training program operating within Camp Ironridge's administrative structure, using official resources for unauthorized purposes while maintaining operational security that had prevented detection by normal oversight mechanisms. Do we know who's running this parallel operation? Harris asked, studying organizational charts that showed clear discrepancies between official assignments and actual personnel deployment. Based on access patterns and authorization signatures. The operation appears to be centered around personnel from the base's Special Operations Training Cadre. The timing coincides with the arrival of a classified training unit that was supposed to be conducting routine readiness exercises. The implications were staggering. A Special Operations unit was conducting unauthorized training using diverted resources while maintaining operational security that suggested they were either exceeding their mission parameters or operating under classified orders that hadn't been properly coordinated with base administration. Hayes, this is way beyond medical department authority. We need to elevate this to base command immediately. Harris reached for his secure communication device, but Amelia's next revelation stopped him cold. Sir, there's something else. The training exercises they're conducting based on equipment requisitions and supply consumption patterns. They're practicing hostage rescue and counter-terrorism scenarios using live ammunition and explosive ordnance. The medical supplies they're diverting suggest they're expecting significant casualties during training operations. Harris stared at the documentation spread across his desk, realizing that they'd stumbled onto something that could represent either a critical security operation or a dangerous violation of training protocols that put base personnel at risk. We need to know what they're actually doing out there, he said finally. But approaching this through normal command channels could compromise a legitimate classified operation or tip off a rogue unit that's operating outside proper authority. The dilemma was classic military bureaucracy. Taking action without proper authority could undermine legitimate operations, while failing to act could allow dangerous activities to continue unchecked. The solution would require someone with the skills to conduct covert reconnaissance without official authorization or backup support. Sir, Amelia said carefully, the next phase of their training appears to be scheduled for tomorrow night, based on supply consumption patterns and personnel movement logs. If we could observe their operations directly, we'd know whether we're dealing with authorized activities or something that requires immediate intervention. Harris looked at her with new understanding. Hayes, what you're suggesting is unauthorized surveillance of a potentially classified operation by medical personnel who lack proper training or authority for such activities. If you're wrong about this, it could end both our careers. If I'm right about this, sir, and we don't act, it could end lives. The weight of that statement settled over both of them as they considered the implications of action versus inaction. Military careers were built on following proper procedures and respecting command authority, but both officers had sworn oaths that prioritized mission success and personnel safety over bureaucratic convenience. All right, Harris said finally, but you don't go alone, and you don't engage directly regardless of what you observe. Reconnaissance only, with immediate withdrawal if you encounter any indication of discovery or danger. That evening, as Camp Ironridge settled into its normal off-duty routine, Amelia prepared for an operation that would require skills she'd never expected to use during her military medical career. Her grandfather's training had included fieldcraft and reconnaissance techniques that went far beyond basic marksmanship, knowledge that had seemed like interesting history lessons during her youth. Now, as she gathered equipment for unauthorized surveillance of a potentially rogue military operation, those lessons took on urgent practical importance. She would need to move through hostile territory, observe dangerous activities, and extract intelligence without detection, exactly the kinds of skills that Daniel Hayes had insisted might someday prove more valuable than medical training. Her equipment selection reflected the dual nature of her mission: standard medical supplies in case of emergency, communication devices for coordination with Harris, and specialized gear that would have surprised anyone who still thought of her as typical medical support personnel. The leather journal that had documented wind patterns and ballistic calculations now contained detailed tactical analysis of terrain features, observation positions, and extraction routes. Her planning was as methodical as any special operations professional, because she understood that mistakes in reconnaissance could be fatal for everyone involved. As darkness settled over Camp Ironridge, Amelia moved toward the canyon system where unauthorized training exercises were reportedly taking place. She had no way of knowing that within hours, she would witness activities that would force her to choose between medical neutrality and direct action, between staying hidden and revealing capabilities that would shock every person who thought they understood. Lieutenant Amelia Hayes, the gentle nurse, was about to discover that some situations require more than medical expertise, and some threats can only be neutralized by someone willing to grab a rifle and demonstrate exactly what trained lethality looks like when applied with surgical precision. The base's assumptions about their medical support were about to be shattered by the sound of gunfire that would echo through the canyons, and through their understanding of what it truly meant to be a soldier. The canyon system east of Camp Ironridge transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and whispered threats as Amelia moved through terrain that had become a battlefield without declaration. Her approach to the suspected training area required 3 hours of careful movement through rocky ravines and scrub vegetation, every step calculated to avoid detection by personnel who might be operating with night vision equipment and sophisticated surveillance methods. Through her field glasses, positioned on a ridge overlooking a natural amphitheater carved into the canyon floor, Amelia observed an operation that immediately confirmed her worst suspicions. The scene below resembled a movie set designed to simulate urban warfare, complete with mock buildings, defensive positions, and scenarios that went far beyond routine military training exercises. 12 personnel in full combat gear were conducting what appeared to be hostage rescue training, but with a level of realism and equipment sophistication that raised immediate concerns about authorization and safety protocols. Live ammunition was being used in close-quarter scenarios. Explosive charges were creating actual structural damage to training props, and the medical supplies she'd tracked were being consumed to treat injuries that were clearly more serious than typical training accidents. The unit leader was someone she recognized: Captain Marcus Stone, officially assigned to administrative duties but apparently commanding an operation that involved leave-fire exercises with civilian role-players who showed obvious signs of genuine fear rather than training participation. The scenarios being practiced weren't standard military operations, but rather activities that resembled private security work or mercenary training. Alpha Team, initiate breach sequence, Stone commanded through his radio, his voice carrying across the canyon with professional authority. Remember, we need clean extractions with minimal collateral damage. Real-world rules of engagement apply. The breach that followed was executed with precision that impressed even Amelia's trained eye. But the ammunition being expended was live rounds. The explosive charges were creating genuine hazards, and the hostages were reacting with terror that seemed authentic rather than simulated. Through her field glasses, Amelia observed details that painted a disturbing picture of an operation that had crossed the line from training exercise to something approaching actual combat operations. The civilian role-players weren't volunteers from the base. They appeared to be local residents who were genuinely terrified of the heavily armed soldiers conducting rescue operations around them. One of the civilians, a middle-aged woman who was playing the role of hostage, was showing signs of genuine medical distress. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. Her skin showed the pallor of shock, and her movements suggested someone experiencing cardiac symptoms rather than training. Stress, Amelia's medical training, overrode her reconnaissance mission as she watched the woman collapse during what was supposed to be a simulated rescue scenario. The soldiers continued their exercise, treating her collapse as part of the role-playing scenario rather than recognizing genuine medical emergency. Medical emergency in progress, she whispered into her radio, hoping Colonel Harris was monitoring the agreed-upon frequency. Civilian casualty requires immediate intervention. Harris's response was immediate but unhelpful. Hayes, maintain observation position. Do not compromise mission by revealing your location. Below in the canyon, the collapsed woman was being ignored by soldiers who were focused on completing their training scenario according to predetermined timelines. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly, and Amelia could see symptoms that suggested cardiac arrest requiring immediate intervention. The decision she faced represented everything her grandfather had tried to prepare her for during those summer training sessions. Sometimes he'd told her, the right choice requires abandoning safety, revealing capabilities, and accepting consequences that extend far beyond personal considerations. Amelia secured her observation equipment and began moving toward the canyon floor. Her approach route calculated to provide maximum cover while allowing rapid access to the medical emergency. Her movement was silent and efficient, using terrain features and vegetation to mask her approach from personnel, who were focused on their training scenarios. The distance to the collapsed civilian was approximately 400 yards across open ground that offered minimal concealment. Reaching her would require crossing the active training area during live fire exercises, exposing herself to both accidental injury and discovery by personnel who might react unpredictably to unauthorized presence in their operational area. But medical emergencies don't wait for convenient timing, and cardiac arrest doesn't respect training schedules or operational security concerns. Amelia's medical oath required action regardless of personal risk or professional consequences. Approach to the training area was methodical and professional, using fieldcraft skills that would have impressed special operations instructors. She moved from cover to cover, timing her advancement to coincide with training noise that would mask any sounds of her movement. First soldier to spot her was Private Williams, a young specialist who was providing security for the training scenario. His reaction was immediate and aggressive, swinging his rifle toward what he perceived as an unauthorized intruder in a live-fire training area. "Halt! Identify yourself!" Williams shouted, his voice carrying across the canyon and immediately alerting every person in the training area to potential security breach. Amelia raised her hands to show she was unarmed, but continued moving toward the collapsed civilian whose condition was becoming critical with each passing second. "Medical emergency," she called out. "I'm a nurse from the base medical facility." Captain Stone's reaction was swift and decisive. Weapons on target. Unauthorized personnel in active training area. His command caused 12 rifles to swing toward Amelia's position, creating a situation that had escalated from medical emergency to potential combat engagement. "Stand down," Amelia commanded with authority that surprised everyone present, including herself. Medical emergency takes priority over training exercises. Stone approached her position with aggressive confidence, his rifle trained on her center mass and his finger positioned near the trigger guard. "You're in violation of restricted training area. Withdraw immediately or face consequences for interfering with classified operations." "This isn't a classified operation," Amelia replied, reaching the collapsed civilian and immediately beginning medical assessment. "This is unauthorized training using diverted resources and civilian participants who didn't consent to life-threatening scenarios." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored. Stone's expression shifted from aggressive confidence to something approaching concern as he realized that their operation had been discovered and analyzed by someone with detailed knowledge of their activities. "You don't know what you're talking about," Stone said, but his tone carried less conviction than his words suggested. "This is legitimate training authorized at levels above your clearance." Amelia's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she began CPR on the collapsed woman, her medical training taking precedence over the rifles pointed in her direction. "Cardiac arrest, probably stress-induced," she reported to no one in particular. She needs immediate evacuation to medical facility. The soldiers surrounding her faced a dilemma that their training hadn't prepared them for. They were pointing weapons at a medical officer who was providing life-saving treatment to a civilian casualty created by their unauthorized training exercise. Shooting her would create problems that extended far beyond their current situation, but allowing her to continue could expose operations that they'd been ordered to keep secret. "Captain." Sergeant Morrison's voice carried uncertainty that reflected the complexity of their situation. "What are your orders?" "She's providing medical treatment, but she's also compromised our operational security." Stone's hesitation revealed the fundamental weakness of their position. They were conducting unauthorized operations using military resources while endangering civilian lives, and their discovery by base medical personnel created accountability that couldn't be eliminated through intimidation or threats. "You have 30 seconds to withdraw," Stone declared, trying to regain control of the situation that was rapidly spinning beyond his authority. "After that, you'll be considered a hostile force interfering with military operations." Amelia looked up from her patient with eyes that held no fear, only professional determination and something else that made Stone step backward involuntarily. "Captain, I suggest you reconsider your threat. You're pointing weapons at a medical officer, providing emergency care to a civilian casualty. That's not a military operation, that's a war crime." The silence that followed carried weight that everyone present understood. Stone's unit had crossed multiple lines of military law and proper authority, and their current actions were compounding violations that could result in court-martial proceedings for everyone involved. "Furthermore," Amelia continued, her voice carrying authority that contradicted her gentle appearance, "I've documented your unauthorized operations, resource diversions, and safety violations. This training exercise is terminated immediately." Stone's finger moved toward his trigger as he realized that their security had been completely compromised by someone who possessed evidence that could destroy their careers and land them in military prison. The woman performing CPR on their casualty wasn't just a witness, she was an intelligence threat that required immediate elimination. But as Stone prepared to cross the final line from unauthorized training to outright murder, he made a crucial error in judgment. He assumed that a medical officer would be defenseless against trained infantry soldiers, that gentleness meant weakness, and that someone focused on saving lives would be incapable of taking them. Lieutenant Amelia Hayes was about to demonstrate that all of those assumptions were catastrophically wrong, and that the most dangerous person in any conflict is often the one whose capabilities have been completely underestimated by people who confused appearance with reality. The gentle nurse was done being gentle, and 50 soldiers were about to learn what true fear looked like when precision met lethality in the hands of someone who had spent years hiding exactly how dangerous she could be when circumstances demanded action rather than compassion. The transformation happened in the space between heartbeats, so fast that most of the soldiers surrounding Amelia never understood what they were witnessing until it was already over. One moment, she was kneeling beside a cardiac arrest patient, her hands performing CPR with methodical medical precision. The next moment, Captain Stone was staring down the barrel of his own sidearm, somehow transferred from his holster to her grip in a movement too fluid to track. "Lower your weapons," Amelia commanded, her voice carrying an authority that none of them had heard before. The gentle nurse was gone, replaced by someone whose eyes held the kind of cold calculation that comes from training designed to kill, efficiently and without hesitation. "All of you, now." Stone's rifle remained trained on her position, but his confidence had evaporated like morning mist. The woman holding his pistol with professional competence wasn't the medical support they'd been threatening. She was someone whose capabilities they'd completely misjudged. "You made a tactical error, Captain," Amelia said, her tone conversational despite the lethal situation. "Never assume someone's limitations based on their job description." My grandfather taught me that lesson when I was 12. Private Williams, positioned 15 feet to her left, made the mistake of adjusting his grip on his rifle, preparatory to engaging what he still believed was a non-combatant medical officer. The movement was subtle, but Amelia's peripheral vision caught the shift in his stance. The shot that followed was surgical in its precision. Williams's rifle flew from his hands as Stone's sidearm barked once, the bullet striking the weapon's receiver with enough force to render it completely inoperable without harming the soldier holding it. The demonstration of marksmanship was so precise, so impossibly accurate under combat stress, that every soldier present understood they were facing someone whose capabilities exceeded their own. "That was a warning," Amelia announced, keeping Stone's pistol trained on center mass while maintaining her position beside the cardiac arrest patient. "The next shots won't be aimed at equipment." Sergeant Morrison, who had spent weeks mocking the gentle nurse's presumed limitations, found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about combat effectiveness and professional competence. The woman who'd been dismissed as typical medical support had just demonstrated shooting skills that would have impressed designated marksmen. "Who the hell are you?" Stone demanded, his voice carrying a mixture of fear and professional curiosity. "Lieutenant Amelia Hayes, registered nurse, granddaughter of Master Sergeant Daniel Hayes, Korean War sniper with 43 confirmed kills." Her introduction was delivered with clinical precision, each word chosen to communicate exactly how dangerous she could be when circumstances required lethal action rather than medical care. The genealogical information hit Stone like physical impact. Daniel Hayes was legendary among military snipers, a man whose techniques were still taught in advanced marksmanship schools decades after his retirement. If this woman had been trained by him, everything they thought they understood about her capabilities was not just wrong, it was lethally wrong. "Impossible," Reeves whispered from his position behind cover. "Nurses don't get that kind of training. Nurses who grew up on Wyoming ranches with grandfathers who believed in comprehensive education do," Amelia replied, never taking her eyes off Stone while continuing chest compressions on her patient with her free hand. 6 summers of intensive training in marksmanship, fieldcraft, tactics, and combat medicine. Everything a soldier needs to know, taught by someone who'd proven those skills in actual combat. The cardiac arrest patient beneath her hands was responding to treatment, her pulse strengthening under Amelia's continued CPR efforts. But the woman's recovery was creating additional complications for Stone's unit, because a living witness would be able to testify about their unauthorized operations and the circumstances that had led to her medical emergency. "You're creating problems that go beyond this training exercise," Stone said, his tactical mind calculating options that were all bad. "There are operational security considerations that exceed your clearance level. Captain, your operational security became my concern when you pointed weapons at a medical officer providing emergency care." Amelia's response carried the kind of moral authority that comes from someone who'd chosen correctly when facing impossible decisions. "Your unauthorized operations end now." Stone's hesitation revealed the fundamental weakness of his position. He was commanding personnel who'd been conducting illegal activities using military resources, and their discovery by someone with evidence and authority to report their violations created accountability that couldn't be eliminated through intimidation. But Stone had invested too much in his rogue operation to accept exposure and court-martial without fighting. His finger moved toward his trigger as he made the calculation that eliminating witnesses was preferable to facing the consequences of his actions. The second shot came before Stone's finger completed its trigger pull, but this time Amelia wasn't aiming at equipment. The bullet struck Stone's right shoulder with surgical precision, disabling his shooting arm while avoiding vital organs that would have resulted in fatal injury. He dropped his rifle immediately, clutching his wounded shoulder while staring at someone whose medical oath clearly didn't prevent her from using lethal force when protecting patients and stopping criminal activity. Medical officers are non-combatants until someone threatens their patients, Amelia announced to the remaining soldiers, who were now facing someone they'd completely underestimated. At that point, we become combatants with medical training, which makes us more dangerous than regular infantry because we know exactly where to shoot, to disable rather than kill. Demonstration had shifted power dynamics completely. Soldiers who'd spent weeks mocking the gentle nurse now found themselves outgunned by someone whose capabilities exceeded their own, while her moral authority remained unquestioned. She was providing medical care to their casualty while neutralizing threats to operational security with precision that bordered on miraculous. Anyone else want to threaten a medical officer? Amelia asked, her tone suggesting that additional demonstrations of her capabilities would be less gentle than the precision shooting she'd already displayed. Morrison dropped his rifle immediately, raising his hands in surrender to someone he'd consistently underestimated. "Ma'am, we surrender." No additional hostile action intended. The remaining soldiers followed Morrison's lead, recognizing that resistance against someone with superior marksmanship skills and unquestioned moral authority would be both futile and professionally suicidal. They'd been conducting unauthorized operations, endangering civilian lives, and threatening medical personnel violations that would result in court-martial proceedings, regardless of their training unit's official status. Excellent decision, Amelia approved, maintaining her defensive position while continuing treatment of her cardiac patient. Now, someone needs to provide immediate medical assistance to Captain Stone, whose shoulder wound requires attention before blood loss becomes problematic. The request was delivered with professional medical concern rather than vindictive satisfaction. Despite having been threatened with lethal force by Stone's unit, Amelia's medical oath required her to ensure proper care for all casualties, including those who'd created the emergency through their own criminal actions. Private Rodriguez approached Stone's position with obvious reluctance, his medical training limited to basic battlefield first aid that might not be adequate for treating precision gunshot wounds. "Ma'am, I'm not qualified for this kind of trauma care. Apply direct pressure to control bleeding. Establish 4 access for fluid replacement, and prepare for evacuation to base medical facility," Amelia instructed while monitoring her cardiac patient's vital signs. Standard trauma protocols apply regardless of how the injuries were acquired. Her ability to provide detailed medical instruction while maintaining tactical awareness impressed soldiers who were beginning to understand that their assumptions about medical personnel capabilities had been fundamentally flawed. The woman they dismissed as gentle support staff was demonstrating competence that exceeded most of their combat specialists. Sound of approaching helicopters announced the arrival of base security forces, alerted by Colonel Harris when Amelia's radio transmissions had indicated combat engagement in the canyon system. The official response would complicate Stone's operational security but provide backup support for a situation that had escalated beyond individual capability to resolve. Base security inbound, Morrison reported, consulting his tactical radio. ETA approximately 10 minutes for full response team. Amelia nodded acknowledgement while checking her patient's pulse, which had stabilized under her continued treatment. "Inform them we have 2 casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation and multiple personnel requiring security processing for unauthorized operations." The approaching intervention would trigger investigations that would reveal the full scope of Stone's rogue training program. But Amelia's primary concern remained the medical emergencies that had resulted from their criminal activities. Her demonstration of combat capabilities had been necessary to protect patients and stop illegal operations, but her fundamental identity remained that of a medical professional whose oath required saving lives regardless of circumstances. As base security helicopters appeared over the canyon rim, soldiers who'd spent weeks mocking the gentle nurse found themselves under arrest by Personnel who'd been alerted by someone whose capabilities they'd never bothered to understand. The woman they'd dismissed as inadequate medical support had proven to be more competent, more dangerous, and more professional than any of them had imagined possible. Lieutenant Amelia Hayes had grabbed a rifle and shown them true fear. But more importantly, she demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous person in any situation is the one whose capabilities everyone has consistently underestimated. The gentle nurse had become their worst nightmare, not because she'd abandoned her medical principles, but because she'd proven that those principles, when combined with superior training and moral courage, created someone more formidable than conventional soldiers could ever hope to become. Investigation that followed the canyon incident transformed Camp Ironridge more profoundly than any training, exercise, or command restructuring in the base's 40-year history. Within 72 hours of the arrests, Colonel Wellington found himself conducting the most complex inquiry of his military career, one that would ultimately reshape how the entire military establishment evaluated personnel capabilities and institutional assumptions. The conference room that had once showcased competitive marksmanship scores now displayed evidence boards detailing the conspiracy that had operated under the noses of base command for months. Financial records, supply manifests, personnel movement logs, and classified communications painted a picture of systematic deception that extended beyond Captain Stone's immediate circle to include civilian contractors, off-base personnel, and potentially compromised elements within the military command structure. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Wellington addressed the assembled investigation team, his voice carrying the weight of someone who discovered that his own base had been compromised by criminal activity. What we're dealing with here goes far beyond unauthorized training exercises. This was a sophisticated operation designed to use military resources for private, contractor work while maintaining operational security through institutional blind spots. General Patricia Morrison, flown in from Pentagon to oversee the investigation, studied the evidence with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to identifying systemic failures before they became strategic disasters. Her presence indicated that the canyon incident had attracted attention at levels that would determine careers and potentially influence military policy for years to come. Colonel Wellington, General Morrison said, consulting the preliminary investigation report, explained to me how a medical officer with no intelligence training was able to uncover an operation that evaded detection by your security personnel, administrative oversight, and command structure. The question cut to the heart of institutional failure that extended beyond simple criminal activity. Stone's operation had succeeded because it exploited assumptions about personnel capabilities, bureaucratic blind spots, and the kind of compartmentalized thinking that prevented comprehensive security analysis. Wellington looked across the conference room to where Lieutenant Amelia Hayes sat with characteristic composed attention, her wire-rimmed glasses and professional demeanor unchanged despite having become the center of a multi-agency investigation that would influence military policy at the highest levels. General, Lieutenant Hayes approached this investigation with methodology that exceeded our standard security protocols. Her analysis was more comprehensive, more systematic, and more accurate than anything our conventional investigation procedures would have produced. General Morrison's attention focused on Amelia with new interest. The preliminary reports had described exceptional marksmanship and tactical capabilities, but the suggestion that medical personnel had demonstrated superior investigative skills carried implications that extended beyond individual competence to systemic evaluation of how the military assessed and utilized talent. Lieutenant Hayes, General Morrison said, "Walk me through your investigation methodology. I want to understand how medical personnel developed analytical capabilities that our intelligence specialists missed." Amelia stood and approached the evidence boards with the same methodical precision that characterized everything she did. Her presentation was organized like a medical case study. each piece of evidence building toward diagnosis and treatment recommendations that demonstrated thinking processes the military rarely encountered from non-intelligence personnel. General medical training emphasizes pattern recognition, differential diagnosis, and systematic analysis of seemingly unrelated symptoms to identify underlying causes, Amelia began, pointing to financial records that showed subtle but consistent anomalies. I applied those same analytical methods to supply discrepancies, personnel movement patterns, and resource allocation data. Her explanation continued for 30 minutes, detailing investigative techniques that combined medical methodology with fieldcraft skills that no one had suspected she possessed. The analysis was so thorough, so professionally executed, that it exceeded the capabilities of personnel specifically trained for security investigations. Furthermore, Amelia concluded, the tactical situation in the canyon required immediate medical intervention regardless of operational security concerns. Military medical personnel are trained to prioritize life-saving treatment over administrative considerations, which placed me in position to observe activities that normal security protocols wouldn't have detected. General Morrison studied the evidence presentation with growing understanding of how institutional assumptions had created vulnerabilities that criminal elements had exploited successfully. The military's compartmentalized approach to personnel evaluation had prevented recognition of capabilities that crossed traditional specialty boundaries. Lieutenant Hayes, General Morrison said, your investigation revealed systematic security failures that could have compromised base operations indefinitely. Your tactical response prevented casualties and ended criminal activity that was using military resources for unauthorized purposes. Most importantly, you've demonstrated analytical and operational capabilities that suggest our current personnel evaluation methods are fundamentally inadequate. The assessment carried implications that extended far beyond individual recognition to systemic reform of how the military identified, evaluated, and utilized personnel whose capabilities exceeded traditional specialty boundaries. Colonel Harris, who had authorized Amelia's expanded investigation, found himself fielding questions from Pentagon officials who wanted to understand how medical personnel had developed investigative skills that surpassed dedicated security specialists. General Lieutenant Hayes approached this investigation with fresh perspective, unburdened by conventional assumptions about what medical personnel could or should accomplish, Harris explained. Her success suggests that our specialty-based evaluation system may be preventing us from recognizing exceptional capabilities that don't fit traditional categories. The investigation's findings were damning for everyone except Amelia. Stone's operation had diverted over $200,000 in military resources while endangering civilian lives and compromising base security. Multiple personnel faced court-martial proceedings for violations that could result in lengthy prison sentences and dishonorable discharge. But the larger revelation was institutional failure that had allowed criminal activity to flourish because evaluation systems prevented recognition of capabilities that could have detected and stopped the operation months earlier. We need to discuss Lieutenant Hayes' future assignment, General Morrison announced during the investigation's final briefing. Her demonstrated capabilities exceed current utilization, and her success suggests we're not adequately identifying or developing similar talent throughout military medical services. The conversation that followed would influence military personnel policy for decades. Amelia's combination of medical expertise, investigative capability, and tactical competence represented exactly the kind of cross-functional talent that modern military operations required, but traditional evaluation systems failed to recognize or develop. General, I'd like to remain in medical service, Amelia said when asked about her preferences for future assignment. Patient care remains my primary professional interest, but I'm willing to accept additional responsibilities that utilize other capabilities when circumstances require. Her response reflected the kind of professional flexibility that military leadership valued, but rarely encountered from personnel who demonstrated exceptional abilities in multiple areas. Most specialists wanted assignment to positions that matched their strongest skills, but Amelia was offering to maintain medical focus while providing additional capabilities when needed. The solution that emerged from those discussions would create a new category of military medical personnel officers with standard medical training enhanced by advanced investigative, tactical, and analytical capabilities that could be deployed when situations required expertise that crossed traditional specialty boundaries. Lieutenant Hayes will be promoted to captain and assigned as special medical advisor with expanded authority for security-related medical investigations, General Morrison announced. Additionally, she developed training protocols to identify and develop similar capabilities in other medical personnel. The assignment represented more than individual advancement. It acknowledged that the military's most valuable personnel might be those whose capabilities couldn't be captured by traditional evaluation categories. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been among the first to recognize Amelia's exceptional abilities, approached her after the formal briefings concluded. His expression mixed professional respect with personal curiosity about someone who'd consistently exceeded every assumption about capability and potential. "Captain Hayes," Rodriguez said, using her new rank with obvious satisfaction, "I've been wondering something since that first weapons inspection. Did you ever consider combat specialties instead of medical service?" Amelia smiled with the quiet confidence that had always characterized her approach to professional challenges. "Sergeant, my grandfather taught me that the most dangerous warrior is someone who can save lives and take them with equal skill. Medical training doesn't prevent tactical capability, it enhances it by providing knowledge that combat specialists don't typically possess." Rodriguez nodded with understanding. "Knowing exactly where to shoot to disable rather than kill, understanding trauma medicine that can treat what combat creates, analytical skills that can identify threats before they become tactical problems. That's a combination that could revolutionize how we approach military medicine." The institutional changes that followed Amelia's investigation went far beyond personnel policy to influence training curricula, evaluation procedures, and organizational structures that had remained unchanged for decades. Her success had demonstrated that the military's most valuable assets might be personnel whose capabilities crossed traditional boundaries in ways that conventional evaluation systems couldn't measure or predict. Ironridge itself underwent complete restructuring, with new protocols designed to prevent the kind of compartmentalized thinking that had allowed Stone's operation to flourish undetected. Security procedures were enhanced, medical personnel received expanded training in investigative techniques, and evaluation systems were modified to identify capabilities that exceeded traditional specialty limitations. But perhaps most importantly, the base's culture shifted from rigid hierarchy based on single-skill competence to recognition that true military effectiveness required personnel who could adapt, analyze, and respond to challenges that didn't fit conventional categories. The gentle nurse who had been mocked for not fitting traditional expectations had become the catalyst for institutional reform that would influence military medicine for generations. She'd proven that sometimes the most important capabilities are those that can't be measured by conventional standards, and that the most valuable personnel are those who refuse to be limited by other people's assumptions about what they should be able to accomplish. Captain Amelia Hayes had not only survived the system that tried to diminish her, she had transformed it into something better, more flexible, and more capable of recognizing excellence, regardless of where it originated or how it manifested. The revolution was complete, but the real work of building something better was just beginning. 2 years after the Canyon incident that shattered every assumption about military medical personnel, Captain Amelia Hayes stood before the graduating class of the first Advanced Medical Operations course, watching 37 officers who represented the future of integrated military medicine. The auditorium at the newly constructed Hayes Training Center buzzed with anticipation as students who had learned to combine traditional medical expertise with investigative, tactical, and analytical capabilities prepared to receive their certifications. The program that bore unofficial connection to her name had evolved far beyond anything Amelia could have imagined during those early weeks when she'd been dismissed as inadequate medical support. What had begun as recognition of her unique capabilities had grown into a systematic reformation of how the military approached personnel development, talent identification, and the integration of diverse skill sets that modern warfare demanded. "Ladies and gentlemen," Amelia addressed the assembled graduates, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had proven that conventional limitations existed primarily in other people's assumptions. "You represent a new generation of military medical officers who understand that saving lives and protecting lives are complementary rather than contradictory missions." The graduating class reflected diversity that went far beyond traditional demographics to include former infantry specialists who had developed medical expertise, intelligence analysts who had pursued medical training, and medical professionals who had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded their original specialty boundaries. Each student had been selected not for conformity to established categories, but for demonstrated ability to think and operate across the artificial boundaries that had previously limited military effectiveness. Among the graduates sat Lieutenant Sarah Chun, no relation to any previous Chun in Amelia's story, a former explosive ordnance disposal specialist who had combined her technical expertise with medical training to become the military's first specialist in treating bomb-related trauma while maintaining capability to neutralize the devices that created such injuries. Her presence represented exactly the kind of cross-functional thinking that the Hayes program was designed to develop and deploy. "The military has learned something important from recent experiences," Amelia continued, her presentation supported by data that demonstrated measurably improved outcomes from integrated medical operations. "Personnel who can analyze, adapt, and respond across traditional specialty boundaries are not just valuable, they are essential for addressing challenges that don't respect organizational charts or training categories." In the audience, General Morrison nodded approvingly as she observed graduates whose capabilities would have been impossible to develop under previous training systems. The Hayes program had become a model for military education worldwide, demonstrating that the most effective personnel were often those whose talents crossed conventional boundaries in ways that enhanced rather than diminuted their primary expertise. The success stories were compelling and measurable. Graduates of the program had identified security threats that conventional intelligence analysis had missed, provided medical care under conditions that would have challenged traditional combat medics, and developed innovative solutions to problems that required both technical expertise and creative thinking. Captain Rodriguez, now serving as Senior Medical Investigator for Pacific Command, had used Hayes program training to identify and prevent a biological weapons smuggling operation that conventional security procedures would have missed until it was too late. His success demonstrated that medical personnel, with expanded investigative training, could provide security capabilities that complemented rather than competed with traditional intelligence operations. Major Thompson, formerly Sergeant Major Thompson, who had once embodied Camp Ironridge's warrior-first culture, approached Amelia after the graduation ceremony with obvious respect for someone who had proven that his assumptions about combat effectiveness had been fundamentally limited. "Captain Hayes," Thompson said, his tone reflecting genuine appreciation for institutional changes that had improved rather than undermined military effectiveness. "I wanted to apologize for my initial assessment of your capabilities and to thank you for demonstrating that our evaluation systems needed fundamental reform." Thompson's acknowledgement represented broader cultural changes that had occurred throughout the military as the success of integrated training programs became undeniable. The rigid hierarchy that had once dismissed capabilities that didn't fit Established categories had evolved into recognition that the most valuable personnel were often those who refused to be limited by other people's definitions of what they should be able to accomplish. Sergeant Major, your initial assessment was based on incomplete information and institutional assumptions that we've all learned to question. Amelia replied with characteristic generosity. The important thing is that we've created systems that identify and develop capabilities regardless of where they originate or how they manifest. The Hayes Training Center itself had become a symbol of institutional evolution, its facilities designed to support the kind of interdisciplinary learning that traditional military education had rarely attempted. Medical laboratories adjoined tactical training facilities. Investigative analysis centers shared space with patient care simulation areas, and classrooms were configured to support the kind of collaborative problem-solving that modern military operations increasingly are. EQUIRED Dr. Elizabeth Warren, civilian administrator for the Hayes program, had documented outcomes that exceeded every projection for integrated training effectiveness. Her research demonstrated that graduates performed significantly better across multiple evaluation categories compared to traditionally trained personnel, while maintaining the specialized expertise that their primary roles required. Captain Hayes, Dr. Warren said during the post-graduation reception, "I wanted to share some preliminary data from our 5-year outcome study. Hayes program graduates show 43% better performance in complex problem-solving scenarios, 37% higher success rates in multidisciplinary operations, and remarkably, 28% better patient outcomes compared to control groups with traditional medical training." The statistics validated what Amelia had always believed, that capabilities which seemed unrelated were actually complementary when properly integrated. Medical training enhanced tactical thinking by providing understanding of human physiology under stress, while tactical training improved medical effectiveness by developing decision-making skills under pressure that traditional medical education rarely addressed. The impact extended beyond individual performance to influence military policy at strategic levels. The Hayes model had been adopted by allied forces worldwide, creating a generation of military medical personnel whose capabilities exceeded anything previous training systems had produced. Colonel Wellington, now serving as Commandant of Advanced Military Medicine, had implemented the Hayes approach throughout his command structure with results that impressed Pentagon leadership and influenced resource allocation for military education programs. Amelia, Wellington said during a private conversation at the reception, "I've been asked to brief Congress on the Hayes program's success and its implications for military personnel development. The data suggests that traditional specialty-based training may be fundamentally inadequate for modern military requirements." The conversation reflected discussions occurring at the highest levels of military leadership as the success of integrated training programs forced recognition that compartmentalized thinking had been limiting institutional effectiveness in ways that went far beyond individual capability development. But for Amelia, the most satisfying aspect of the program's evolution was its impact on personnel who had previously been undervalued or overlooked because their capabilities didn't fit conventional categories. The Hayes program had created pathways for exceptional talent regardless of how it manifested or where it originated. Lieutenant Michael Foster, a former military cook who had demonstrated exceptional analytical capabilities during routine food service operations, had graduated with distinction from the Hayes program and was now serving as senior medical logistics analyst for European Command. His success demonstrated that exceptional talent could emerge from any background when institutional systems were designed to recognize and develop capabilities rather than enforce conformity to established categories. "Captain, I wanted to thank you personally," Foster said during the reception's closing moments. "Without the Hayes program, I would have remained in food service despite having capabilities that could contribute to medical operations. You created opportunities for people like me who didn't fit traditional categories. Foster's gratitude reflected broader institutional changes that had created advancement opportunities for personnel whose talents had previously been unrecognized or underutilized. The military's loss of exceptional capability due to rigid evaluation systems had been replaced by flexible development programs that enhanced rather than limited individual potential. As the evening concluded and graduates prepared to begin assignments that would utilize their integrated training in operational environments worldwide, Amelia reflected on the journey that had brought her from dismissed medical support to architect of institutional reform that would influence military medicine for generations. Her grandfather's lessons about comprehensive preparation and refusing to be limited by other people's assumptions had proven prophetic in ways he could never have anticipated. The skills he had taught during summer training sessions on a Wyoming ranch had evolved into educational philosophy that was reshaping how the world's most advanced military force identified, developed, and utilized human talent. The Leather Journal, that had once documented wind patterns and ballistic calculations, now contained strategic planning notes for medical education programs that would train thousands of officers whose capabilities would exceed anything previous generations had achieved. Her methodical approach to problems had evolved from individual survival skill to institutional transformation tool that would influence military effectiveness for decades. Walking across the campus that bore unofficial connection to her name, Amelia could see tomorrow's students preparing for training that would challenge every assumption about professional limitations and capability boundaries. They would learn to think across traditional categories, to integrate diverse skill sets, and to approach problems with the kind of comprehensive analysis that she had learned from her grandfather and proven during her own military service. The gentle nurse who had been mocked for not fitting conventional expectations had become the catalyst for changes that would influence how militaries worldwide approached personnel development, talent identification, and the integration of capabilities that traditional training systems had never attempted to combine. She had proven that sometimes the most important transformations begin with individuals who refuse to accept other people's definitions of what they should be able to accomplish. The military had learned to value personnel who could save lives and take them with equal skill, who could analyze complex problems while providing expert medical care, and who could adapt to challenges that didn't respect organizational boundaries or training categories. Captain Amelia Hayes had grabbed a rifle when circumstances demanded action, but more importantly, she had grabbed an entire institution and transformed it into something more flexible, more effective, and more capable of recognizing excellence regardless of where it originated or how it manifested. The revolution was complete, but the real legacy would be measured in lives saved, threats neutralized, and problems solved by personnel who had learned that the most dangerous assumption anyone can make is that gentle people are not capable of extraordinary things when circumstances require them to exceed every expectation about what they should be able to accomplish. The woman they had tried to dismiss as inadequate medical support had become the architect of institutional transformation that would influence military medicine for generations, proving that sometimes the most important victories are won not on battlefields, but in the minds of people who learn to recognize exceptional capability regardless of the package in which it arrives. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.